November 26, 1943. Skies above Bremen, Germany. After landing, Major Francis Gabreski recorded the moment in his logbook. The pencil shook slightly as he wrote. These were words that would have seemed impossible only 8 months earlier, when experienced RAF pilots had openly questioned if the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt could survive against nimble German fighters. The Luftwaffe will learn to fear the dive. We have discovered something they cannot match. Gabreski had just watched his squadron execute a maneuver that contradicted every assumption learned from the First World War about aerial combat doctrine, all from the frost-covered canopy at 28,000 feet. Instead of turning horizontally to engage, his pilots rolled inverted and plunged straight down at speeds nearing 500 miles per hour, a velocity that would have torn the wings off any other European theater fighter. Death never approached from directly above, so the Messerschmitt Bf-110s never saw it. One moment they were confidently climbing toward the vulnerable Boeing B-17 flying fortresses. The next, 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns were pouring devastating fire into their fuselages. The fighter that delivered this attack seemed to appear out of the sun, like a thunderbolt from Zeus himself. The mathematics of aerial supremacy were being rewritten, not in rate of climb or turning radius, but in the terrifying physics of a nearly 4-ton fighter achieving terminal velocity in a controlled dive. That accumulated kinetic energy was then used to zoom climb back to altitude, where turbocharging and thin air gave American pilots an insurmountable advantage. Gabreski, protecting the bomber stream, destroyed 2 Bf-110s that day using these tactics, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. From skepticism to supremacy, the transformation had begun on April 13, 1943, when the 56th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission, a fighter sweep over Saint-Omer in occupied France. The pilots were nervous. They had trained on the P-47 Thunderbolt for 8 months, but many remained skeptical about the aircraft's combat potential. The Thunderbolt was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built, weighing nearly 14,000 pounds fully loaded in standard combat configuration, and up to 17,500 pounds with external stores. It outweighed the graceful Supermarine Spitfire by 4,000 pounds and dwarfed the Focke-Wulf FW-190 by 3,000 pounds. Detractors nicknamed it the 7-ton milk jug, eventually shortened to simply the Jug. RAF pilots, who had successfully defended Britain in nimble Spitfires, openly questioned whether a massive aircraft like this could survive against agile German fighters flown by experienced Luftwaffe pilots. Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson, fresh from pilot training and terrified he would die in his first week of combat, was among the doubters. His personal accounts, documented in his memoir co-written with Martin Caden and in multiple post-war interviews, would chronicle one of the most dramatic transformations in aviation warfare history. The journey from skepticism to mastery began at the Republic Aviation Factory in Farmingdale, Long Island. Here, Georgian engineer Alexander Kartveli had designed something radically different from every other fighter in existence. Kartveli had famously sketched the P-47 design on a train after the XP-44 project was cancelled, later describing his creation with characteristic humor as a dinosaur, but a dinosaur with good proportions. The physics of power. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine was built into the P-47, featuring 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. It generated 2,000 horsepower at sea level at rated power, with water injection boosting output for combat emergencies to 2,300 horsepower. Some variants, like the P-47M, would eventually achieve 2,800 horsepower, making them among the most powerful piston engine fighters ever constructed. A sophisticated turbo supercharger system, buried deep in the rear fuselage, channeled this immense power and became the key to everything the P-47 could achieve. Exhaust gases were piped along both sides of the cockpit through extensive ducting to drive a General Electric turbine mounted in the belly, spinning at 21,300 revolutions per minute at full power. This turbine compressed incoming air, feeding it back to the engine through an intercooler system that increased density and lowered temperatures. The result was revolutionary. The R2800 was allowed by the system to produce maximum power at 27,000 feet. At 30,000 feet in the thin stratosphere, where other fighters gasped for oxygen. The Thunderbolt remained more powerful and faster than any German fighter. Up to its service ceiling of 42,000 feet, the P-47 could operate effectively, an altitude where Luftwaffe pilots found their aircraft struggling for performance. However, this remarkable capability came with significant weight. Skeptics believed the resulting aircraft was simply too heavy to maneuver effectively in combat. The complex ducting for the turbocharger system, thick armor plate behind the seat and a 69-pound armored headrest protecting the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks containing 370 gallons of internal fuel, and 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns with 425 rounds per gun, totaling 3,400 rounds of ammunition, all contributed to this. Before any external stores were added, the empty weight alone exceeded 9,900 pounds, and combat-loaded weight pushed past 14,000 pounds. The baptism of fire. "I saw the challenges ahead," Lieutenant Johnson wrote in correspondence after his April 13th first mission. "The Germans had been fighting for years. We were entering combat in an aircraft that many believed was the wrong tool for the job. Yet Colonel Hubert Zemke seemed confident we would find our way." The missions through late April and into May 1943 were cautious operations. Fighter sweeps over the coast, testing equipment, learning the terrain, gradually building experience without rushing into major engagements that could devastate an inexperienced unit. The first real test came on June 12, 1943, during a mission designated RAF Rodeo 204 over the Belgian coast. Following the altitude advantage doctrine that Colonel Zemke had been drilling into his pilots, Captain Walter V. Cook of the 61st Fighter Squadron spotted a Focke-Wulf FW-190 at lower altitude near Blankenberg, Belgium. Cook dove on the unsuspecting German fighter, watched the FW-190 tumble toward the ground, trailing smoke after firing a burst from his 850 caliber guns. This was the 56th Fighter Group's first confirmed aerial victory, and it had been achieved using the diving attack that would become their trademark. The very next day, June 13, 1943, validated the tactics Zemke had been developing, bringing the 56th Fighter Group 3 more victories. Lieutenant Robert Johnson scored his first kill that day, diving from altitude onto an FW-190 over Bruges, France. The German pilot never saw him coming. Johnson watched it spin into the ground after firing a precise burst and seeing strikes on the enemy fighter. Major General Karl Spatz, commanding the 8th Air Force, personally presented him with a bottle of Scotch whiskey to mark the occasion of being among the first 8th Air Force pilots to score victories in the new P-47 when Johnson landed. Johnson also learned a harsh lesson that day, however. His element leader had not followed to provide cover during the attack, and Johnson found himself under attack by multiple German fighters and isolated. He was simultaneously reprimanded by his commanders, including Zemke, Gabreski, and Captain Gerald W. Johnson, for breaking formation during the engagement, even though his kill was confirmed. Tactical discipline was of critical importance, as the incident highlighted. Diving attacks required mutual support and coordinated execution. If pilots were lost to enemy fighters during or after their attack runs, individual glory meant nothing. Taming the high-speed dive nothing in those early missions, though, had prepared the pilots for what would be discovered during high-altitude testing back in the United States. Lieutenants Harold Comstock and Roger Dyer had pushed their P-47C Thunderbolts into near-vertical dives from 35,000 feet during high-altitude performance testing on November 13, 1942, months before the 56th Fighter Group even deployed to England. What happened next would prove crucial to understanding the P-47's true limitations and capabilities. Their airspeed indicators climbed past 500 mph, past 600 mph, eventually showing 725 mph indicated airspeed. Because pitot static instruments become increasingly inaccurate at high altitudes and high speeds, the actual true airspeed was certainly lower, likely in the 550 to 600 mph range. Republic Aviation would claim the pilots had exceeded the speed of sound, making them the first humans to break the sound barrier. This claim was disputed by many aviation experts, and General Henry Hap Arnold sent a telegram to Republic ordering that there would be no more discussion about the dive. Post-war analysis and subsequent testing indicated the highest confirmed Mach number achieved by any World War II propeller-driven fighter was approximately Mach 0.92 by a specially modified Supermarine Spitfire, and P-47s likely did not exceed this threshold. Nevertheless, what Dyer and Comstock experienced during those dives would prove critically important for combat operations. Beyond approximately 550 MEPS indicated airspeed, they encountered severe compressibility effects as localized airflow over the wings approached transonic velocities. The controls became completely unresponsive to normal stick inputs. They were rigid. Conventional recovery seemed impossible. The aircraft were diving nearly straight down, continuously accelerating. Both pilots experienced genuine terror as their aircraft plunged earthward with frozen controls, along with tunnel vision from the G-forces. But Dyer and Comstock both managed to recover, and their technique would be taught to every P-47 pilot who followed. The critical procedure, later documented by combat pilots including Charles D. Moyer, was to push firmly on the control stick with both hands while keeping the trim tabs locked in a neutral position. Pilots were explicitly warned never to adjust trim tabs during compressibility recovery, as over-control would likely result when the aircraft descended into denser air and controls suddenly regained effectiveness. The correct technique required using manual stick pressure, pulling firmly but not desperately, and maintaining that pressure while the aircraft descended through the compressibility region. The aircraft would begin responding to control inputs as the P-47 descended into denser air at lower altitudes, usually below 15,000 feet, and the compressibility effects would gradually diminish. The pilot could then complete the pullout. With less than 2,000 feet to spare, Dyer and Comstock bottomed out their recoveries, their bodies compressed into their seats by forces exceeding 7 or 8 times gravity. When they reported their experience to Republic Aviation and Wright Field engineers, the response was immediate and thorough. Extensive training in recognizing compressibility onset and executing proper recovery procedures would be received by every P-47 pilot. More importantly, engineers discovered that the P-47's thick wing design, which made it a poor turner compared to thinner winged fighters, actually delayed the onset of critical compressibility effects. The Thunderbolt could recover more reliably and dive faster than any contemporary fighter. Later, P-47D variants would be equipped with dive recovery flaps, small surfaces that could be deployed during high-speed dives to assist with recovery and help manage compressibility. This capability would prove absolutely decisive in combat. The boom and zoom, Doctrine Colonel Zemke drilled his pilots relentlessly throughout May and June 1943 in the tactics that would exploit the P-47's unique strengths. Climb to 30,000 feet or higher before reaching the combat area. Maintain disciplined formation, with proper spacing for mutual support. Never chase enemy fighters down to low altitude where the P-47's weaknesses in turning and acceleration were exposed when enemies appeared below. Roll inverted to keep the target in sight. Pull 4 to 5G to point the nose downward and dive at maximum throttle setting. The accumulated speed, often exceeding 480 miles a p, and sometimes reaching 500 miles a second or more, made the P-47 nearly impossible for German fighters to evade. The attacking pilot would fire a burst from 8 50 caliber machine guns. With each gun cycling at approximately 800 rounds per minute, a combined rate of fire of around 6,400 rounds per minute, or over 100 rounds per second, was created. Even a 2-second burst delivered devastating firepower at high closing speeds. Then, before German fighters could react or defensive measures could be taken, the P-47 pilot would pull back firmly on the stick, use all that kinetic energy to zoom climb back above the fight, and regain altitude advantage within 40 to 60 seconds. The skeptics remained numerous through those early months. Many pilots found it difficult to abandon traditional fighter tactics, which emphasized twisting and turning to get behind the enemy. Some questioned whether running away in a dive could truly be called fighting. Survivability, and the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. The engagement on June 26, 1943, during escort duty for B-17 bombers returning from a mission to Villers-Coublay, France, proved both costly and educational. 16 Focke-Wulf FW-190s of Jagdgeschwader 26 bounced 48 P-47Cs of the 56th Fighter Group near Forges-les-Eaux. Lieutenant Johnson's P-47C, nicknamed Half Pint, was hit early in the fight by multiple 20mm cannon shells. Hydraulic lines were severed, spraying fluid across his windscreen. His canopy shattered. The cockpit briefly caught fire. Partial disorientation and bleeding were caused by shrapnel from exploding cannon shells striking Johnson's nose. Most pilots would have abandoned the aircraft immediately. But Johnson discovered his canopy would not open, trapping him in the dying fighter. With no choice but to fly or die, Johnson pushed the nose down and dove for the English Channel at maximum speed. An FW-190 followed, repeatedly firing into the already crippled P-47C. More cannon shells tore through Johnson's fuselage and wings. The German pilot apparently expended all his ammunition on the defenseless American fighter, then flew alongside, looked directly at Johnson, saluted, and broke away. Johnson never knew whether this represented respect for courage or simply an acknowledgement that further attacks were pointless. Despite taking multiple hits, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine continued running. The robust airframe, designed with thick structural members and redundant systems, held together despite catastrophic damage. Johnson coaxed the battered P-47C across the English Channel, executed a perfect landing at RAF Manston Emergency Airfield despite having almost no forward visibility through the hydraulic fluid-coated windscreen. Ground crews counted over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes in the aircraft without completely circling it. The right wing had severed structural members. The fuselage had holes large enough to insert a fist. Hydraulic systems were completely destroyed. Yet Johnson walked away with only minor injuries from shrapnel, and remarkably, the P-47C was eventually repaired and returned to service. This mission cost the 56th Fighter Group 4 aircraft and pilots, their worst single mission loss to date. But it also demonstrated the P-47's extraordinary ability to absorb punishment and bring pilots home alive. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943, provided the first major validation of diving attack tactics on a large scale. The 8th Air Force launched 376 heavy bombers in a daring double strike against aircraft production facilities at Regensburg and ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in Germany. The bombers would fly hundreds of miles beyond the escort range of most Allied fighters. The P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group were assigned to provide penetration escort for the Regensburg force, taking the bombers as far as their fuel allowed before turning back toward England. Major Gabreski, leading elements of the 61st Fighter Squadron, positioned his flights at 30,000 feet, 5,000 feet above the bomber stream. German fighters, approximately 40 Bf-109s and FW-190s in several formations, were climbing from multiple airfields across northern France and Belgium, timing their arrival to catch the bombers when P-47 escorts would be at the limit of their fuel range. The coordinated diving attack from superior altitude was not what the German pilots expected. Multiple P-47 flights simultaneously rolled inverted, pointed their noses at steep dive angles between 45 and 60 degrees, and accelerated toward the climbing German fighters at speeds the Luftwaffe pilots had never encountered from American fighters in combat. Spreading across 70 miles of German and Belgian airspace, the engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes. P-47 pilots executed textbook diving attacks, struck hard, and recovered to altitude for repeated attacks. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 16 German fighters destroyed, 9 damaged, and 1 probable, for the loss of 3 P-47s. German records documented 22 aircraft lost that day across all units. With 11 pilots killed and 8 more wounded, Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, Gruppenkommandeur of the Zwecken, Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 26, and brother of the famous General Adolf Galland, was among the dead. Before encountering P-47 diving tactics he could not counter, Galland had scored 55 victories. Captain Walker, Bud Mahurin of the 56th Fighter Group, was credited with the probable kill, striking Galland's FW-190 with a concentrated burst after diving from altitude at over 480 mph. The German fighter disintegrated from the concentration of .50 caliber fire. Galland's body was found 2 months later, still strapped in his seat, driven 12 feet into the ground by the impact. The psychological impact on remaining Jagdgeschwader 26 pilots was profound. One of their most experienced leaders had been killed by tactics he never saw coming. More importantly for the strategic picture, the bomber stream lost far fewer aircraft than expected during the period when P-47 escort was present. The Thunderbolts had proven they could protect the bombers that were systematically destroying Germany's ability to wage war. The real measure of success was this: high kill ratios mattered only insofar as they protected the bombers and allowed the strategic bombing campaign to continue. Tactical maturation and the ace status. The full maturation of P-47 diving tactics came in October 1943, demonstrating kill ratios that would have seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. What properly trained pilots using correct doctrine could achieve was shown by the missions that month. On October 4th, 1943, during an escort mission to Frankfurt, the 56th Fighter Group encountered approximately 60 German fighters attempting to intercept the bomber stream near Cologne. Using disciplined diving attacks and altitude advantage, the 56th destroyed approximately 15 Bf-110 twin-engine fighters along with single-engine fighters, claiming 16 total victories while losing 2 P-47s to anti-aircraft fire rather than enemy fighters. Lieutenant Johnson, flying as wingman to Captain Gerald W. Johnson on October 8th, executed another textbook diving attack that brought his score to 4 victories. Positioned at 29,000 feet over Bremen, Johnson spotted an FW-190 attacking another P-47 from the pilot's blind spot. Johnson rolled inverted, pulled 4G to point his nose at the German fighter below, and pushed the throttle to maximum emergency power. At 26,000 feet and 460 MEP, he squeezed the trigger, 850. Caliber machine guns converged their fire on the FW-190. Johnson saw pieces flying off the German fighter before it rolled over and fell spinning toward the ground. Immediately, Johnson pulled back to zoom climb, gained 3,000 feet of altitude in less than 30 seconds, and was back in position to assist other squadron members within 1 minute. The entire attack sequence, from initial roll-in to altitude recovery, took approximately 50 seconds. This was the essence of boom and zoom tactics executed to perfection. 2 days later, on October 10, 1943, Johnson became an ace during a massive engagement over Münster. His squadron intercepted approximately 40 German fighters attempting to destroy B-17s during their withdrawal from the target area. In the swirling battle that followed, Johnson executed 3 separate diving attacks within 25 minutes. He destroyed 1 Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine fighter and 1 Focke-Wulf FW-190 escort, bringing his total score to 5 confirmed victories and earning ace status. Unknown to Johnson at the time, one of these victories was Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, commander of Jagdgeschwader 1, an extraordinarily experienced pilot with 206 total victories, including 29 in the West and 177 on the Eastern Front. Johnson would not learn this pilot's identity until 50 years later when American and German researchers compared combat reports. But Johnson paid a price for pressing his attacks aggressively that day. He was hit by return fire from a Bf-110's rear defensive gunner during his final diving run. 20mm cannon shells tore through his right wing and fuselage, damaging control surfaces and destroying hydraulic systems. The P-47D began smoking and losing hydraulic fluid rapidly. Johnson began what would become one of the longest flights of his life, pointing the damaged aircraft toward England. German fighters recognized a crippled opponent and moved in for the kill. 3 separate times, FW-190s attempted to finish off Johnson's damaged Thunderbolt. 3 times Johnson pulled away from his pursuers, building speed to over 400 mph despite severe vibration and damaged controls by pushing his nose down. Even critically damaged, the P-47D could still outdive any German fighter. Johnson nursed the shaking, smoking aircraft across Belgium and over the English Channel at gradually decreasing altitude. He brought the battered fighter down in a textbook landing at an emergency landing field, despite minimal forward visibility and severely degraded controls. Ground crews marveled that Johnson had survived, counting the damage. The P-47D had over 200 bullet and cannon shell holes. The right wing had lost structural integrity with multiple longerons severed. Damage that penetrated deep into critical systems was present in the fuselage, but the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 had continued running smoothly throughout, losing only 1 or 2 of its 18 cylinders. Despite catastrophic battle damage, the airframe had held together. Johnson walked away without serious injury, and after extensive repairs, the P-47D returned to combat operations. Something as important as the diving tactics themselves was demonstrated by these October 1943 missions. The P-47 combined offensive capability through high-speed diving attacks with defensive survivability through robust construction and redundant systems. A pilot could press attacks aggressively, knowing that the aircraft could likely bring him home, even if hit. This psychological confidence enabled better mission results and more aggressive tactics. The legacy of vertical thinking. By November 1943, the 56th Fighter Group's tactical doctrine was being adopted throughout the 8th Air Force. Every P-47 unit learned to think vertically rather than horizontally. Altitude was life, speed was survival, discipline was victory. The maxims were clear. Never chase an enemy down to his altitude unless absolutely necessary for bomber protection. Never turn when you can dive. Never engage fairly when you can attack with overwhelming advantage. The kill ratio statistics from this period demonstrate extraordinary effectiveness. The 56th Fighter Group achieved kills to losses ratios approaching 11-1 during the period from June through December 1943, when tactics were fully developed and pilots gained combat experience, when considering only aircraft lost to enemy fighters in air combat. Even when including all operational losses from ground fire, weather, and mechanical failures, the ratio remained above 5-1. Kill ratios exceeded 15-1 and occasionally approached 20-1 in ideal conditions. When examining only engagements where P-47, pilots maintained altitude discipline and followed diving attack. Doctrine. The tactics worked because they exploited fundamental physics that could not be countered by tactical innovation or pilot skill. A P-47 at 30,000 feet had potential energy equivalent to 9.4 million foot-pounds. When diving to 20,000 feet, this converted to kinetic energy, producing speeds approaching or exceeding 500 mph. No German fighter could safely match this speed. The FW-190's maximum dive speed was limited to approximately 450 km indicated airspeed before structural concerns became critical. The Bf-109 faced similar limitations, with additional control difficulties at high speeds. A P-47 pilot could climb back to 28,000 or 29,000 feet using accumulated kinetic energy after firing on a target at 20,000 feet and pulling 4 to 5 G in the recovery. The entire attack cycle, from 30,000 feet down to 20,000 feet and back up to 28,000 feet, consumed less than 90 seconds and required minimal fuel. A German fighter attempting to climb from 20,000 feet to 30,000 feet required 4 to 6 minutes and consumed significant fuel, while the pilot's engine continuously lost power as altitude increased. Psychological impact and the human cost. The psychological effect on Luftwaffe. Pilots became measurably significant by early 1944 and late 1943. German combat reports increasingly mentioned avoiding engagement with P-47s above 25,000 feet, concentrating their efforts on attacking bombers during their final descent or initial climb. When P-47 escort was less effective, some squadrons began refusing to climb to high altitude altogether. But this reduced attack effectiveness and exposed German fighters to defensive fire from the bombers. Major Günther Rall, who commanded the Sekundäre Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 11 for approximately 1 month from April 19 to May 12, 1944, before being shot down and wounded, later provided insight into German tactical thinking. Rall explained in post-war interviews that by late 1943, experienced German pilots recognized the P-47 was most dangerous when it had altitude advantage. American pilots were learning to use their aircraft correctly, refusing to be lured down to altitudes where German fighters had acceleration and turning advantages. Instead, P-47s attacked repeatedly from above. Diving so fast, German pilots could barely track them visually, firing quick bursts and climbing away before effective response was possible. If German fighters climbed to meet the P-47s, the American fighters simply climbed higher using superior high-altitude engine performance duck attacking bombers quickly from lower altitudes and escaping before P-47s could dive on them was the only partial solution German units developed. But this gave German pilots less time to aim carefully, and bomber defensive fire was more effective against attacks from below. Rall survived the war with 275 total victories, the third highest score in aviation history, and later served in the West German Luftwaffe from 1956 to 1975. Exceptional physical conditioning and technique were required by the diving tactics. Pulling out of a 500 mph dive generated G-forces exceeding 7 times gravity. Blood drained from the brain toward the lower body. Vision narrowed to a tunnel. At the bottom of their dives, some pilots lost consciousness briefly, recovering only as the aircraft naturally began to level off. P-47 pilots developed anti-G straining techniques, borrowed from dive bomber operations to counter this. They would vigorously tense abdominal muscles and leg muscles during the pullout, effectively helping maintain blood flow to the brain and raising blood pressure. They would grunt or shout loudly, forcing air pressure into their chest cavity and lungs. They learned to limit their pullout to 6 to 6.5 G when possible, accepting a slightly shallower recovery angle to reduce blackout risk while still achieving effective zoom climb performance. These techniques, combined with fitness and youth, allowed most pilots to remain conscious and effective throughout their attack runs. But the physical toll accumulated over time. Pilots who flew multiple high-intensity missions per day would return to base physically exhausted, their bodies aching from repeated high-G maneuvers. Chronic back pain from compression of the spine during pullouts afflicted others. Vision problems from repeated exposure to high G-forces were experienced by some pilots. The final validation. New challenges were brought. By the winter of 1943 into 1944, as missions penetrated deeper into Germany and the bombing campaign intensified, the 56th Fighter Group encountered over 100 German fighters in a desperate attempt to destroy the bomber stream during an escort mission to Oschersleben, deep in central Germany on January 11, 1944, spreading across 150 miles of German airspace. The engagement lasted nearly 1 hour. Major Gabreski, now serving as the group's operations officer, led formations from 29,000 feet. He personally executed 6 separate diving attacks during the extended engagement, destroying 3 enemy aircraft and damaging 2 more. His combat report described the mission as the most intense he had experienced, with German fighters and P-47s mixing in a swirling aerial battle that consumed thousands of rounds of ammunition and thousands of gallons of fuel. The 56th Fighter Group claimed 22 German fighters destroyed that day for the loss of 4 P-47s, 1 to mechanical failure and 3 to enemy fighters. The kill ratio of approximately 5.5 to 1 was still impressive given the duration and intensity of the engagement, though slightly below the group's average. More significantly, bomber losses were far lower than expected. Only 5 B-17s were shot down during the period when P-47 escort was present. Operation Argument, known to participants as Big Week, was brought by February 1944, 6 days, from February 20th through the 25th, of maximum effort bombing raids against German aircraft production facilities. Over 3,000 heavy bomber sorties were launched by the 8th Air Force, and the Luftwaffe responded with everything available. The 56th Fighter Group flew 16 major missions during Big Week and its immediate aftermath, logging more combat hours than any other fighter group. The diving tactics perfected over 9 months of combat were now being executed by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience against German pilots with decreasing experience levels. The results during this period were devastating for the Luftwaffe. The 56th Fighter Group destroyed approximately 87 enemy aircraft in aerial combat through Big Week and into the first half of March, far exceeding previous monthly totals. Without loss, they destroyed 15 German fighters on February 20th during an escort to Leipzig. Escorting bombers to Halberstadt on February 22nd, they destroyed 12 more. The accumulated effect of these losses broke the Luftwaffe's ability to effectively defend German airspace in daylight. German fighter units were losing experienced pilots faster than training programs could produce replacements. New German pilots arrived at operational units with minimal flight time, often less than 50 hours in type, compared to American pilots arriving with 150 to 200 hours of flight training. These inexperienced German pilots were particularly vulnerable to P-47 diving attacks. They lacked the situational awareness to see attackers coming from above. They made mistakes in defensive maneuvering. They played directly into the P-47's greatest strength, reflexively panicking and diving away. Largely achieved by March 1944 was air superiority over Germany. German fighters still appeared, but in smaller numbers and with noticeably less aggressive tactics. The 56th Fighter Group flew escort all the way to Berlin and back on March 6, 1944, without encountering a single German fighter willing to engage at high altitude. The Luftwaffe had learned through painful experience that engaging P-47s above 25,000 feet was nearly suicidal. P-47 pilots began transitioning increasingly to fighter-bomber missions, carrying 500 lb or 1,000 lb bombs and high-velocity aircraft rockets to attack ground targets. But the diving attack capability remained crucial even in the ground attack role. P-47s would orbit at high altitude above 25,000 feet, spot targets like truck convoys or locomotive repair facilities, roll in from altitude in steep dives exceeding 60 degrees, release their weapons from 4,000 to 6,000 feet, and climb back to safety before anti-aircraft gunners could accurately track and engage them. The same physics that made the P-47 a devastating air superiority fighter made it an equally effective fighter-bomber. Aces and the unstoppable combination Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, who became the highest-scoring American ace in the European theater, achieved his final victory on July 5, 1944, bringing his total to 28 confirmed kills. All were achieved flying P-47 Thunderbolts with the 56th Fighter Group. Gabreski's luck ran out 15 days later on July 20, 1944. While strafing Bassenheim airfield at low altitude, his P-47 struck the ground, damaging the propeller and forcing him to crash land in German-held territory. He was captured and spent the final 9 months of the war as a prisoner. Gabreski consistently credited the diving attack tactics developed by Zemke for the 56th Fighter Group's success in post-war interviews. When we arrived in England in January 1943, Gabreski reflected years later, most pilots believed the P-47 was too cumbersome and heavy to be effective. British pilots told us we would be slaughtered. For the first weeks, it appeared they might be right when pilots tried to fight the traditional way, twisting and turning to get behind the enemy. Then Colonel Zemke showed us a different approach. We stopped trying to turn with German fighters. We started using our real advantages: diving speed, altitude performance, and structural strength. We attacked from above, struck hard, and recovered to altitude before the enemy could respond. Suddenly we were winning. The same aircraft that seemed like a liability became our greatest asset. Robert Johnson finished his combat tour with 27 confirmed victories in 91 missions, becoming the first USAAF fighter pilot in Europe to exceed Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I score of 26 victories. Johnson was rotated home in May 1944 and spent the remainder of the war training new pilots and selling war bonds on publicity tours. Johnson emphasized the importance of tactical doctrine and discipline in his memoir, Thunderbolt, co-written with Martin Caidin. Individual courage and flying skill mattered, he wrote, but properly executed tactics based on aircraft capabilities mattered more. An excellent pilot using incorrect tactics would be defeated by a mediocre pilot. Following correct doctrine, the ultimate success of diving attack doctrine is demonstrated by the final statistics of the 56th Fighter Group's operations. The group flew 447 combat missions from April 1943 through April 1945. They achieved 674 and won 2 confirmed aerial victories, more than any other fighter group in the 8th Air Force, according to U.S. Air Force Historical Study number 85. They lost 60 aircraft to enemy fighters in air-to-air combat, producing a kill ratio of 11.2.1, including all operational losses, totaling 128 aircraft from all causes including ground fire, weather, and mechanical failures. The kill ratio remained approximately 5.3 to 1. These statistics represented not just numbers, but lives saved and missions accomplished. Every German fighter destroyed meant one less threat to the bomber streams. Every bomber protected meant crews survived to fly again and targets were destroyed. The strategic bombing campaign succeeded in large part because P-47s and other escort fighters achieved air superiority over Germany, allowing bombers to systematically destroy the industrial capacity sustaining the German war. Effort, technical mastery, and enduring lessons individual. Pilots achieved remarkable records using tactics developed through the 56th Fighter Group's experience. Francis Gabreski's 28 victories all came in P-47s. Robert Johnson's 27 victories were all achieved in P-47s. David Schilling scored 22 and 3/4 victories in P-47s. Walker Mahurin achieved 21 victories with the 56th before transferring to other duties. All of these aces credited their success to diving attack tactics developed by Zemke and refined through hundreds of combat missions. The P-47's overall performance across all theaters validated the diving attack approach. The Thunderbolt flew over 746,000 sorties of all types during World War II. It achieved an aerial kill ratio of 4.6.1, while losing 3,499 aircraft to all causes in combat. This overall ratio masked substantial variation between units and theaters. Groups that consistently employed proper high-altitude diving tactics achieved kill ratios between 8:1 and 15:1. Units that deviated from doctrine or operated primarily at low altitudes, where the P-47's disadvantages were exposed, achieved much lower ratios. The technical specifications that enabled these tactics represented a masterpiece of engineering by Alexander Kartveli and the Republic Aviation Team. The P-47D variant that equipped most combat units featured a wingspan of 40 feet 9 inches, length of 36 feet 1 inch, and height of 14 feet 8 inches. Combat loaded weight varied from 14,000 to 17,500 lb depending on external stores. Maximum speed reached 433 mph at 30,000 feet. Rate of climb was approximately 2,700 ft per minute at sea level, increasing at altitude due to turbocharger effectiveness. Service ceiling was 42,000 feet. Combat radius with external tanks reached approximately 460 miles, sufficient for escort missions into central Germany. The armament of 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing with 425 rounds per gun, totaling 3,400 rounds, provided sustained firepower for approximately 30 seconds of continuous firing. In practice, pilots fired in short bursts of 1 to 3 seconds, making ammunition last for 10 to 15 separate engagements. The 50 caliber round, weighing approximately 1.7 oz, with armor-piercing incendiary characteristics, could penetrate aircraft aluminum structure, damage engines, rupture fuel tanks, and incapacitate pilots at ranges exceeding 500 yards. The Pratt & Whitney R2859 engine in standard. P-47D models displaced 2,800 cubic inches across, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows of 9 cylinders each. At rated power, the engine produced 2,000 horsepower at 2,700 revolutions per minute. Output increased to 2,300 horsepower for up to 5 minutes, with water methanol injection activated, designated as war emergency power. This immense power drove a 4-blade Curtiss electric propeller with 12 feet 2 inches diameter. The propeller absorbed such tremendous power that at high speeds, the tips approached sonic velocity, creating vibration and noise that warned pilots they were reaching compressibility thresholds. The turbocharger system represented the most sophisticated aspect of the design. The General Electric Type B11 turbo supercharger, housed in the rear fuselage, used exhaust gases from all 18 cylinders to spin a turbine wheel at up to 21,300 revolutions per minute. This turbine drove a centrifugal compressor that pressurized incoming air to sea-level equivalent density even at 30,000 feet altitude. The compressed air passed through an intercooler that increased density and reduced temperature further before entering the engine's supercharger for final compression. This 2-stage system allowed the R2800 to maintain maximum rated power up to 27,000 feet, far exceeding the critical altitude of non-turbocharged engines. The structural design featured remarkable robustness. The main wing spar could withstand loads exceeding 8G positive or 3.5 G negative. The fuselage bulkheads and longerons were designed for crash loads that would protect the pilot even in severe accidents. Armor protection included a 69 lb armored headrest, a 1.4 in armor plate behind the pilot's seat, a 3.8 in armor plate protecting the engine accessories, and bulletproof glass windscreen panels. Self-sealing fuel tanks contained rubber and fabric layers that would swell when punctured by projectiles, sealing holes and preventing catastrophic fuel leakage. These technical features combined to create an aircraft optimized for high-altitude combat using energy tactics. The P-47 could climb to 30,000 feet, dive to attack from superior position at speeds no enemy could match, absorb battle damage that would destroy lighter fighters, and zoom climb back to altitude for repeated attacks. This tactical cycle could continue until ammunition or fuel was exhausted. German fighters attempting to counter these tactics faced impossible choices: Climb to meet the P-47s at altitude where American performance advantages were maximized. Attempt to lure them down where German advantages lay. But P-47 pilots refused to follow or avoid engagement entirely and concede air superiority. The triumph of physics and discipline. The impact of P-47 diving tactics extended beyond immediate combat results into broader strategic effects. The Luftwaffe's failure to defend German airspace in 1944 stemmed partly from unsustainable pilot losses inflicted by P-47s and other American fighters. German training programs could not replace experienced pilots quickly enough. New pilots with minimal training became easy targets for American pilots executing disciplined tactics. The accumulating experience advantage compounded over time. By spring 1944, average American fighter pilots in frontline units had substantially more combat experience and flight hours than their German counterparts. This experience advantage, combined with effective tactics and superior high-altitude performance, created an insurmountable situation for the Luftwaffe. The strategic bombing campaign succeeded in destroying German oil production, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and transportation networks. Fighter escorts achieving air superiority was absolutely dependent on this success. The P-47's contribution to this air superiority, achieved through diving attacks from altitude, represented one of the decisive factors enabling Allied victory in Europe. The lessons learned with the P-47 influenced fighter design and doctrine for decades afterward. Post-war analysis confirmed that boom and zoom tactics, which exploit superior speed and energy management, were fundamentally more effective than traditional turning dogfights when facing comparable opponents. The jet fighters that followed, including the F-86 Sabre that achieved success in Korea and the F-100 Super Sabre that followed, emphasized climb rate, speed and energy tactics over turning capability. Francis Gabreski flew F-86 Sabres in Korea, applying the same energy management principles he learned in P-47s over Germany. He shot down 6 and 1 and 2 MiG-15s in Korea, making him one of only 7 American pilots to achieve ace status in 2 different wars. The tactics that worked against Bf-109s and FW-190s over Germany worked equally well against MiG-15s over Korea. Maintain altitude advantage, dive on the enemy at high speed, fire a quick burst, zoom climb back to safety. The speeds and aircraft changed, but the fundamental tactical principles remained valid. German prisoners interviewed after the war consistently identified P-47 diving attacks as among the most frightening experiences of aerial combat. Oberleutnant Heinz Knocker, who surrendered in March 1945 after surviving years of combat, including being shot down multiple times, told American intelligence officers that the P-47 represented a psychological terror beyond its physical capabilities. "You would be climbing to engage the bombers," Knocker explained, "and suddenly your wingman would explode beside you. You would look up and see American fighters diving nearly vertically at impossible speeds. By the time you reacted, they were already pulling up and climbing away, completely untouchable. You could not catch them climbing. You could not evade them diving. You could only hope they would choose a different target next time." The physics of the diving attack remained unmatched throughout the propeller-driven fighter era. Modern computer simulations using authentic flight models and performance data have confirmed what P-47 pilots discovered through combat experience. In engagements where the P-47 maintained altitude discipline and used diving attacks exclusively, kill ratios exceeded 20-1 against comparable German fighters. Only when P-47 pilots violated doctrine and engaged in low-altitude turning fights did German fighters achieve favorable exchange ratios. The lesson was unambiguous. Tactics that exploited an aircraft's actual strengths would always defeat tactics based on wishful thinking about desired capabilities. The P-47 was not the most agile fighter. It was not the best climbing fighter below 20,000 feet. It was not the longest range fighter until late variants appeared. But it was the most survivable fighter, the fastest diving fighter, and the most capable high-altitude fighter. Tactics built around these real strengths produced extraordinary results. The 56th Fighter Group's achievement stands as one of the great tactical success stories of World War II. They took an aircraft that critics claimed was too clumsy and too heavy for air combat. They identified its actual advantages through systematic analysis and testing. They developed tactics that exploited those advantages while minimizing exposure to disadvantages. They trained relentlessly in those tactics until execution became instinctive. They maintained discipline under the most stressful combat conditions imaginable. The result was air superiority over Germany and the protection of thousands of bomber crewmen who successfully completed their missions thanks to thunderbolts diving from above. Colonel Hubert Zemke, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group during its critical development period and established the tactical doctrine that made it successful, later reflected on the transformation. "When I took command in September 1942, he wrote in his post-war memoir, I had an aircraft that everyone said was wrong for the mission and pilots who were terrified they would be slaughtered by experienced German pilots. I had to find what the P-47 could do well and build tactics around those capabilities. The dive became everything. We could dive faster than anyone. We could recover from dives that would kill other pilots. We could zoom, climb back to altitude, and do it again. Once we mastered this, we became unstoppable. By war's end, the P-47 had proven itself as one of the most effective fighter aircraft in history. Its overall record of 746,000 sorties with a 4.611 kill ratio represented solid performance. But these aggregate statistics masked the true capability demonstrated by well-trained units following proper doctrine. The 56th Fighter Group's 11.1 kill ratio, considering only air combat losses, or 5.3 to 1, including all operational losses, demonstrated what could be achieved with proper tactics and discipline. Individual pilots who mastered the diving attack achieved even more remarkable records. Gabreski's 28 victories in 166 missions, Johnson's 27 victories in 91 missions, Schilling's 22 and 3-4 victories in 132 missions, all represented success rates approaching 1 victory per 4 combat missions. These ratios exceeded what most air forces considered possible for sustained periods. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt and its diving tactics is ultimately a story about the triumph of analysis over assumption, discipline over improvisation, and physics over tradition. Every expert in early 1943 knew that heavy fighters could not succeed against light, agile opponents. Every assumption about aerial combat since the First World War emphasized climb rate and turning ability. Every fighter pilot wanted a responsive light aircraft that could outmaneuver the enemy in twisting dogfights. Then a group of American pilots led by Hubert Zemke climbed to 30,000 feet in the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built, rolled inverted, pushed the stick forward, and discovered that every conventional assumption was wrong. They found that straight down at 500 mph was the fastest path to victory, and the zoom climb back to altitude was the most effective defensive maneuver ever conceived. They proved that an aircraft's true capability mattered infinitely more than conventional wisdom about what fighters should be able to do. The Germans, who witnessed these tactics from the receiving end, never forgot the lesson. Neither did the Americans who flew the missions, and neither should historians who study how a supposedly inferior fighter dominated the skies over Europe through superior tactics that exploited unexpected advantages. The P-47 pilots started diving straight down because analysis showed it was the most effective way to attack. They continued diving straight down because combat results proved the analysis correct. They achieved kill ratios approaching 20 to 1 in ideal conditions because proper tactics and physics are more powerful than tradition and courage. That is how you win air superiority. That is how you protect bombers conducting strategic missions. That is how you bring pilots home alive despite facing experienced enemies. You identify your aircraft's true strengths through rigorous analysis. You develop tactics that exploit those strengths while minimizing exposure to weaknesses. You train those tactics until execution becomes instinctive. You maintain discipline even when instinct screams to abandon doctrine. You roll inverted at 30,000 feet. You point your nose at the earth. You accelerate to 500 mph. You fire a precise burst. You pull back firmly on the stick and zoom climb back to altitude before anyone can respond. Do it right. Do it with discipline. Do it with mutual support. And no enemy pilot in the sky can touch you. That was the secret the 56th Fighter Group discovered through months of combat experience, training, and analysis. That was the tactical revolution that changed aerial warfare and helped achieve air superiority over Germany. That was why P-47 pilots started diving straight down. And that was why they achieved kill ratios that approached 20 to 1 in ideal conditions. The answer was not courage, though courage was required. The answer was not superior aircraft, though the P-47 had advantages. The answer was superior tactics rigorously based on physics and executed with unwavering discipline. That combination proved unstoppable,